So Dana White came out and said that should Dricus retain his title, then the UFC will be going to South Africa, definitely. This will be the first time that the MMA leader will be going to Africa. And he said if Adesanya retains his title, then his legacy will only be solidified. You know, for as much as the beef and the rivalry between Adesanya and Dricus is based off of Dricus saying that he would become the first real African champion because he at the time resided in Africa, he trained in Africa, Dana White saying that only justifies what Dricus was saying. Listen, if you did not know their race or you did not know who these people were and you just heard that, hey, there's an African champion who migrated to New Zealand, he now wears the New Zealand flag and his Nigerian flag, and then there's a South African fighter who trains out of South Africa, lives in South Africa, you would most likely say that the South African represents Africa more. And to add to it, the UFC is going to go to Africa because of the South African champ, but the UFC has never gone to Africa because of the Nigerian champion who migrated to New Zealand. Surely you would say that Dricus represents Africa more. But as Adesanya has so clearly on numerous attempts tried to remind us, this is not about the person, this is not about who lives in Africa, this is not about who resides in Africa or trains in Africa, it's about the race of the person who said what he said at the time. Because if you remember very clearly, well, I think everyone would remember, Adesanya asked Dana White to enter the octagon after Dricus did the unthinkable, which is demolish Robert Whittaker. Adesanya entered the octagon and provoked Dricus. He constantly called him the N-word, he constantly told him, yeah, my brother, you're my brother, yeah. You know, Adesanya went back to the hood for Dricus. He wanted Dricus to come to the hood and show that he's really hood, because if you're African, you are hood, because if you're African, you use the N-word. Because the best way to prove that you're African and that you are a true African is by adopting and using American mannerisms and American slangs, because nothing proves that you are African more than using American slangs and using American mannerisms. But I'm not here to critique Adesanya, it's just that his actions, the things he does, makes it so easy to critique him, because at times he doesn't realize that he's being cringe. But don't get me wrong, I do not agree with Dricus saying that he would have become the first real African champion, because training out of Africa and living in Africa for me does not supersede and outshine the hurdles. Well, outshine is such a bad or poor choice of words, but it does not supersede the hurdles and struggles that someone like Francis Ngannou had to go through to become champion. There's this popular image that Francis took where he's sitting in this village room with his mom and the UFC champion is in the background, and on numerous podcasts Francis has said that's the room he grew up in, and that image alone makes you realize that this man represents Africa. He is part, or he had to go through the African struggle to get to where he is, unlike someone like Dricus Duplesis. And Adesanya drives this point, although he doesn't do it coherently or clearly, he does it extremely childishly, because he constantly reminds Dricus that his DNA is not African. And if you don't know anything about South African history, then Adesanya is claiming that Duplesis is a descendant of African settlers. That is what Adesanya is saying that Dricus is, while Adesanya's DNA will show that his heritage is from Africa. And that is where I felt Adesanya shot himself in the foot, because Adesanya is someone who wears and carries the New Zealand colors and represents New Zealand. And I'm assuming in the future, or generations to come, Adesanya's kids would want to see themselves as New Zealanders and would regard themselves as true New Zealanders, regardless of the fact that their ancestors, in this case being Adesanya, migrated to New Zealand from Nigeria. We see all the vlogs and videos of Adesanya building property in New Zealand, and therefore it's safe to assume that he plans to have a legacy in New Zealand. So surely Adesanya would not want his future generation or his future offsprings, well, future offsprings is a bit redundant, but he wouldn't want his offsprings to feel as if they're outcasts, especially if they were born and raised in that country, and that is the only country they have ever known. It is also for this reason I feel Adesanya has shifted his tone from Dricus the colonizer to no, Dricus the fellow African who disrespected us by saying he would be the real champion. We are not real champs, and now I have to teach him a lesson that you should respect your elders. Now, for the most part, people would argue that, hang on, Dricus resides in Africa, therefore his UFC income, the UFC dollar that he earns, benefits the African economy because he spends it there, it gets taxed there, while Adesanya, his UFC dollar gets spent in New Zealand, it gets taxed there. But at the same time, it would be hypocritical to not remember that African is predominantly predominantly a black continent, and therefore the majority of Africans see themselves in Adesanya. Adesanya having to move to New Zealand is not a choice he made as a grown adult. It's a choice that his family took because of the trials and tribulations that they were going through in Nigeria, and they wanted their children to have a better chance at life. They wanted their children to succeed, something which unfortunately at the time was not possible for them in Nigeria. Whilst on the other hand, Dricus had a much enjoyable and softer life in South Africa. He didn't have to leave his homeland because his family had the means and resources to look after him in South Africa. So the battle of Africa and who the real African is not as simple as it may seem. You cannot simply argue that Adesanya is the true African because of his race, because he is born in Africa, because his ancestors are from Africa, etc., etc., because ultimately the other person in this equation was also born in Africa, although his ancestors are not from Africa, although his race is not the common African race, but he is spending his income and his resources in Africa and benefiting his country and bettering his country, whilst the African, or the person whose ancestral lineage is African, is spending it in New Zealand. But at the same time, Dricus does not speak to the common African, and the common African does not see themselves in Dricus the same way that they see themselves in Adesanya. This is exactly why I am irritated that the UFC is having this fight in Australia. The Battle of Africa is being contested in Australia, a region in a country which has never loved Adesanya. They have constantly booed him because he beat their guy Robert Whittaker, and then in the last year that Adesanya was there, they booed him and they favored Sean Strickland, the American. And at the same time, this is the rival nation to South Africa when it comes to rugby, so Dricus has no love lost for Australia. This battle should have been in Africa, and having this fight there would have been an interesting visual and spectacle to see, because who would the African fans root for? Would the South African fans root for one of their own in Dricus Duplesis, or would they root for someone who looks like them and who maybe they identify with in Adesanya? Now, it is most likely that patriotism would take center stage, especially when you consider the long rivalry and history between South Africa and Nigeria, and therefore, although Adesanya is the bigger star than Dricus Duplesis, I would have expected that should the fight had happened in South Africa, Dricus would have gotten the support of his home fans, regardless of their skin tone and their complexion. And should the fight have happened in Nigeria, then most likely Adesanya would have gotten all the support in the world because the Nigerians would have backed him. But alas, the UFC machine decided that this is a fight best suited for Australia because the UFC owes Australia a fight every year, and now we are stuck with watching the Battle of Africa, which had the potential to be marketed to the sky, happen in Australia. And then all these fans are not going there to watch this fight from an emotional standpoint. A lot of these fans will most likely be Adesanya haters or Adesanya fans who want to go see him in action. A lot of these fans who are going to watch are most likely UFC fans, and they appreciate the brand of UFC. And this is something I have noticed about the UFC. It no longer markets fights. It's simply a corporate slap. It is UFC 305, go and watch it. There is no hype behind this fight, and it does not have that intrigue that it would have had should it have been in Africa. We remember Rumble in the Jungle because it happened in Congo, and that fight is memorable. The same potential was there for this fight, and as much as Dana White says should Dricus retain his title, the UFC will go to Africa and have its first fight in Africa, in South Africa. What fight would be more interesting to the African casual, the African MMA fan, than having the biggest African superstar Adesanya versus the South African, the nation hero in MMA, Duplesis? That was the perfect fight to have in South Africa. Now, if Dricus retains his title, you're gonna have Strickland versus Dricus. Surely that is not more enticing than Adesanya versus Duplesis. But let me know in the comment section what you guys think. If you did enjoy this video, made it this far, please do like, subscribe, and what are your thoughts? Till the next one.